Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to start The Book of Blood by Clive Barker. Certainly. Here is an introduction to Books of Blood by Clive Barker. Books of Blood is a collection of horror fiction by British author Clive Barker. Originally published in 6 volumes between 1984 and 1985, these stories are notable for their inventive blend of fantasy and horror, combined with Barker's unique and often graphic storytelling style. The series marked Barker's emergence as a significant voice in the horror genre and has since become a classic. Each volume in the Books of Blood series contains a number of short stories that delve into the macabre and the supernatural, often exploring themes of transformation, hidden desires, and the darkest corners of the human psyche. The stories range from the grotesque to the poignant, frequently incorporating elements of dark fantasy and the surreal. The collection's title story, The Book of Blood, serves as a framing narrative for the entire series. It introduces the concept of a highway of the dead, where spirits travel and inscribe their stories onto the flesh of a living medium, thereby creating a literal book of blood. This haunting and original premise sets the tone for the tales that follow. Barker's prose is vivid and imaginative, often pushing the boundaries of conventional horror. His characters are complex and multidimensional, and his ability to weave intricate plots with unexpected twists keeps readers engaged and unsettled. The series has been praised for its originality, depth, and the way it redefines horror literature. Books of Blood is not just a collection of scare stories, it's a profound exploration of fear, transformation, and the supernatural, making it a must-read for fans of horror and dark fantasy. Clive Barker's masterful storytelling in these volumes cements his legacy as one of the genre's most innovative and influential writers. Everybody is a book of blood. Wherever we're opened, we're read. The Book of Blood. The dead have highways. They run unerring lines of ghost trains, of dream carriages across the wasteland behind our lives, bearing an endless traffic of departed souls. Their thrum and throb can be heard in the broken places of the world, through cracks made by acts of cruelty, violence, and depravity. Their freight, the wandering dead, can be glimpsed when the heart is close to bursting, and sights that should be hidden come plainly into view. They have signposts, these highways, and bridges and laybys. They have turnpikes and intersections. It is at these intersections where the crowds of dead mingle and cross that this forbidden highway is most likely to spill through into our world. The traffic is heavy at the crossroads, and the voices of the dead are at their most shrill. Here the barriers that separate one reality from the next are worn thin with the passage of innumerable feet. Such an intersection on the highway of the dead was located at number 65, Tollington Place. Just a brick-fronted, mock Georgian detached house, number 65 was unremarkable in every other way. An old, forgettable house, stripped of the cheap grandeur it had once laid claim to, it had stood empty for a decade or more. It was not rising damp that drove tenants from number 65. It was not the rot in the cellars, or the subsidence that had opened a crack in the front of the house that ran from doorstep to eaves. It was the noise of passage. In the upper story, the din of that traffic never ceased. It cracked the plaster on the walls and it warped the beams. It rattled the windows. It rattled the mind too. Number 65, Tollington Place, was a haunted house, and no one could possess it for long without insanity setting in. At some time in its history, a horror had been committed in that house. No one knew when or what, but even to the untrained observer, the oppressive atmosphere of the house, particularly the top story, was unmistakable. There was a memory and a promise of blood in the air of number 65, a scent that lingered in the sinuses and turned the strongest stomach. The building and its environs were shunned by vermin, by birds, even by flies. No woodlice crawled in its kitchen. No starling had nested in its attic. Whatever violence had been done there, it had opened the house up as surely as a knife slits a fish's belly. And through that cut, that wound in the world, the dead peered out and had their say. That was the rumour anyway. It was the 3rd week of the investigation at 65, Tollington Place. 3 weeks of unprecedented success in the realm of the paranormal. Using a newcomer to the business, a 20-year-old called Simon McNeil, as a medium, The Essex University Parapsychology Unit had recorded all but incontrovertible evidence of life after death. In the top room of the house, a claustrophobic corridor of a room, the McNeil boy had apparently summoned the dead, and at his request, they had left copious evidence of their visits, writing in 100 different hands on the pale ochre walls. They wrote, it seemed, whatever came into their heads, their names, of course, and their birth and death dates. Fragments of memories and well-wishes to their living descendants, strange elliptical phrases that hinted at their present torments and mourned their lost joys. Some of the hands were square and ugly, some delicate and feminine. There were obscene drawings and half-finished jokes alongside lines of romantic poetry, a badly drawn rose, a game of noughts and crosses, a shopping list. The famous had come to this wailing wall. Mussolini was there, Lennon and Janis Joplin, and nobody's two forgotten people had signed themselves beside the greats. It was a roll call of the dead, and it was growing day by day, as though word of mouth was spreading amongst the lost tribes and seducing them out of silence to sign this barren room with their sacred presence. After a lifetime's work in the field of psychic research, Dr. Florescu was well accustomed to the hard facts of failure. It had been almost comfortable, settling back into a certainty that the evidence would never manifest itself. Now, faced with a sudden and spectacular success, she felt both elated and confused. She sat, as she had sat for 3 incredible weeks, in the main room on the middle floor, 1 flight of stairs down from the writing room, and listened to the clamour of noises from upstairs with a sort of awe, scarcely daring to believe that she was allowed to be present at this miracle. There had been nibbles before, tantalising hints of voices from another world, but this was the first time that Province had insisted on being heard. Upstairs, the noises stopped. Mary looked at her watch. It was 6:17 p.m. For some reason best known to the visitors, the contact never lasted much after 6. She'd wait till 1:30, then go up. What would it have been today? Who would have come to that sordid little room and left their mark? "Shall I set up the cameras?" Reg Fuller, her assistant, asked. "Please," she murmured, distracted by expectation. "Wonder what we'll get today." "We'll leave him 10 minutes." "Sure." Upstairs, McNeil slumped in the corner of the room and watched the October sun through the tiny window. He felt a little shut in, all alone in that damn place, but he still smiled to himself, that warm, beatific smile that melted even the most academic heart, especially Dr. Florescu's. Oh yes, the woman was infatuated with his smile, his eyes, the lost look he put on for her. It was a fine game. Indeed, at first, that was all it had been, a game. Now Simon knew they were playing for bigger stakes. What had begun as a sort of lie detection test had turned into a very serious contest. McNeil versus the truth. The truth was simple. He was a cheat. He penned all his ghostwritings on the wall with tiny shards of lead he secreted under his tongue. He banged and thrashed and shouted without any provocation other than the sheer mischief of it. And the unknown names he wrote, he laughed to think of it, the names he found in telephone directories. Yes, it was indeed a fine game. She promised him so much. She tempted him with fame, encouraging every lie that he invented. Promises of wealth, of applauded appearances on the television, of an adulation he'd never known before, as long as he produced the ghosts. He smiled the smile again. She called him her go-between, an innocent carrier of messages. She'd be up the stairs soon, her eyes on his body, his voice close to tears with her pathetic excitement at another series of scrawled names and nonsense. He liked it when she looked at his nakedness, or all but nakedness. All his sessions were carried out with him only dressed in a pair of briefs to preclude any hidden aids. A ridiculous precaution. All he needed were the leads under his tongue and enough energy to fling himself around for half an hour, bellowing his head off. He was sweating. The groove of his breastbone was slick with it, his hair plastered to his pale forehead. Today had been hard work. He was looking forward to getting out of the room, sluicing himself down, and basking in admiration a while. The go-between put his hand down his briefs and played with himself idly. Somewhere in the room a fly, or flies maybe, were trapped. It was late in the season for flies, but he could hear them somewhere close. They buzzed and fretted against the window or around the light bulb. He heard their tiny fly voices, but didn't question them, too engrossed in his thoughts of the game and in the simple delight of stroking himself. How they buzzed, these harmless insect voices, buzzed and sang and complained. How they complained. Mary Florescu drummed the table with her fingers. Her wedding ring was loose today. She felt it moving with the rhythm of her tapping. Sometimes it was tight and sometimes loose, one of those small mysteries that she'd never analysed properly, but simply accepted. In fact, today it was very loose, almost ready to fall off. She thought of Alan's face, Alan's dear face. She thought of it through a hole made of her wedding ring, as if down a tunnel. Was that what his death had been like? Being carried away and yet further away down a tunnel to the dark? She thrust the ring deeper onto her hand. Through the tips of her index finger and thumb, she seemed almost to taste the sour metal as she touched it. It was a curious sensation, an illusion of some kind. To wash the bitterness away, she thought of the boy. His face came easily, so very easily, splashing into her consciousness with his smile, and his unremarkable physique, still unmanly. Like a girl, really. The roundness of him, the sweet clarity of his skin, the innocence. Her fingers were still on the ring, and the sourness she had tasted grew. She looked up. Fuller was organising the equipment. Around his balding head, a nimbus of pale green light shimmered and wove. She suddenly felt giddy. Fuller saw nothing and heard nothing. His head was bowed to his business, engrossed. Mary stared at him still, seeing the halo on him, feeling new sensations waking in her, coursing through her. The air seemed suddenly alive. The very molecules of oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen jostled against her in an intimate embrace. The nimbus around Fuller's head was spreading, finding fellow radiance in every object in the room. The unnatural sense in her fingertips was spreading too. She could see the colour of her breath as she exhaled it, a pinky-orange glamour in the bubbling air. She could hear, quite clearly, the voice of the desk she sat at, the low whine of its solid presence. The world was opening up, throwing her senses into an ecstasy, coaxing them into a wild confusion of functions. She was capable, suddenly, of knowing the world as a system, not of politics or religions, but as a system of senses, a system that spread out from the living flesh to the inert wood of her desk, to the stale gold of her wedding ring, and further, beyond wood, beyond gold. The crack opened that led to the highway. In her head, she heard voices that came from no living mouth. She looked up, or rather some force thrust her head back violently, and she found herself staring up at the ceiling. It was covered with worms. No, that was absurd. It seemed to be alive, though, maggoty with life, pulsing, dancing. She could see the boy through the ceiling. He was sitting on the floor, with his jutting member in his hand. His head was thrown back like hers. He was as lost in his ecstasy as she was. Her new sight saw the throbbing light in and around his body, traced the passion that was seated in his gut, and his head molten with pleasure. It saw another sight, the lie in him, the absence of power where she'd thought there had been something wonderful. He had no talent to commune with ghosts, nor had ever had. She saw this plainly. He was a little liar, a boy liar, a sweet white boy liar without the compassion or the wisdom to understand what he had dared to do. Now it was done. The lies were told, the tricks were played, and the people on the highway, sick beyond death of being misrepresented and mocked, were buzzing at the crack in the wall and demanding satisfaction. That crack she had opened, she had unknowingly fingered and fumbled at, unlocking it by slow degrees. Her desire for the boy had done that, her endless thoughts of him, her frustration, her heat and her disgust at her heat had pulled the crack wider. Of all the powers that made the system manifest, love and its companion passion and their companion loss were the most potent. Here she was, an embodiment of all three, loving and wanting, and sensing acutely the impossibility of the former two, wrapped up in an agony of feeling which she had denied herself, believing she loved the boy simply as her go-between. It wasn't true, it wasn't true. She wanted him now, deep inside her, except that now it was too late.